It seems like a rather old-fashioned thing, but it's still possible when you arrive at new countries to get a stamp on your passport. Some people still collect them, but is it always wise to do that? And after you get your passport renewed, are they all gone? The man who knows is Owen Corrie from Travel Extra. Afternoon, Owen.
Good afternoon, Sean.
Yeah, because I suppose in most European countries, could you, if you arrive in France, still go up to somebody and say, could you stamp my passport?
It happens a lot. It happens with people who just want to have a stamp on their passport. They're very excited about it. Usually they'll do it. Usually they regard you as a bit of a nuisance because at the moment the number of people travelling through busy airports, processing people quickly has become the thing. Generally, a country that has a passport like Ireland, we've one of the most powerful passports in the world, you don't get stamps. If you do need stamps, it's because you come from a country where visas are required and entry is a big deal.
Yes, yeah, and now there would be countries where it wouldn't be advisable to get a stamp when you arrive there.
Yeah, there's a couple of stamps you don't want in your passport. You really don't want one of the stamps that causes American immigration to raise their eyebrows. If you get an Israeli stamp on your passport, some countries won't let you in. What the way around that, and Israel has been doing this for decades, is to give you a little sheet of paper. They stamp that instead. They look for it. They're looking for an entry date. They're looking for exit dates. That's what immigration people are looking for. And if it's going to cause problem, they won't stamp your passport. It also is a big deal and pretty important for your visa waiver for America. People will remember long ago you had to get a visa for America. You don't anymore. It doesn't mean that you don't need a visa. It means that they've introduced a waiver called the ESTA. Listeners will be very familiar with it. What some people aren't familiar with is that some countries invalidate that visa waiver if you go to places America doesn't like. Not many people go to Libya or North Korea or Syria, but they added Cuba to that list a couple of years ago, and that's caused a few problems.
Well, actually, that happened to me. I was in Somalia last year, and then I had to apply for an ESTA this year, and then, it was have you been to any of these evil countries? And then you have to go down to the... I suspect there's a money-making racket here as well, because the ESTA is only like 20 quid, but the blinking visa is 100 quid.
That's exactly it. It's $100. You have to go for an interview. It can happen if you do something, if anything goes wrong with your application process. Somebody who I will not name on air, when she was going through the process of, all those questions, do you intend to traffic drugs in America, came to, do you intend to commit a terrorist act in the United States of America? She just got so excited. She typed yes. She tapped on yes instead of no. And then she said, that's fine. I'll correct that. But it wouldn't let her do it. She had to toddle into the embassy and get all sorts of clarification letters from guards and things like that to allow her to get the visa. You need a visa if you've been to places. Somalia isn't big on the holiday list for anyone this year, but Cuba is a big one for Europeans. It's caused massive problems in the US Embassy in Madrid because so many Spanish go, and it does cause queues. It also is really, if you're just transiting through America, let's say you're going down to Mexico or up to Canada and you take one of the New York flights, even if you're transiting, you will need an ESTA. So people who've been to Cuba, it is a big deal.
Oh, and so because I know people, Owen, who've been to Cuba but never got the stamp on the passport, and then happily enough got their ESTA and cruised into the US no problem. So they don't know if you've been there, do they?
Not a good idea, because it can show up in the flight records, and then you're guilty of another crime. When you're asked have you been to one of these evil countries, and you say no, and you actually have, you're now guilty of having misrepresented the situation. Tends not to happen when people have an existing ESTA. I don't think many people do it. When it comes up to the list of countries, they generally do fess up, and it's toddle into the embassy for the interview. It isn't a big deal once it's quite clear you've only been to Cuba on holidays. I had a long chat with the US immigration people at the big trade fair IPW in Los Angeles, because I raised it earlier this year, back in April. And you get the impression from them, they can't say this officially, it's a big nuisance for them, but it was the Trump regime added Cuba a couple of years ago to the list.
So are there people, though, Owen, who will always ask for a stamp, who actually, it's their hobby to have stamps in their passports.
Yeah, I mean, you need a big passport if you're traveling a lot. But some people just like having the stamp, and, they're, particularly if a country means something to you, it's somewhere where your ancestors came from, or you've a particular romantic attachment to from honeymoon or whatever. It does happen. You see it happening at airports. Everyone groans because it slows the process down in the queue. But in general, travel internationally is almost like getting the bus to a Haspera. You get on one end, you get off the other. It's passport stamps. But if you're traveling with one of the passports that doesn't get you access to countries like the Bangladeshis or one of those, and it does mean that you have to be stamped in, you have to be stamped out. People are looking at dates. Sometimes an exit stamp when you didn't have an entry stamp can cause a problem. And when there's conflict over territory, North Cyprus and the Republic of Cyprus was a big deal. It's less a big deal nowadays, but it was a big deal at one stage where people would fly in through Turkey and run into trouble if they crossed the border. And as I said, Israel can cause you to be, not let into countries like Dubai. The United Arab Emirates was one of them. Malaysia, unusually, places like that. If you've got an Iranian stamp in your passport, it certainly excludes you from a lot of the countries, not just Israel, but also in the Middle East. Yeah. There are all sorts of problems with stamps.
And you can get I understand you can get a stamp in Antarctica.
This is a real problem. A novelty stamp. Antarctica isn't a country. There are no residents. The only people in Antarctica are scientists and soldiers. But because cruising to Antarctica, usually down from Ushuaia in Argentina, is a big deal. It became a big deal in the 1990s for two reasons, really. It was there was sort of a big interest around the millennium, and a whole lot of old Russian icebreaker ships came on the market. So cruising to Antarctica, somebody set up a little base, a holiday base in Port Lockerbie, and they put novelty stamps on people's passports. They love to have an Antarctica stamp in your passport. Some countries exclusively prohibit it. The Americans specifically say only countries are allowed to place stamp in your passports. And we also have people refused entry to countries because they have novelty stamps. Checkpoint Charlie used to have one in the old days of the GDR. Some towns, some museums, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial in Japan gives you a novelty stamp. It's a great idea at the time until you land in somewhere like Bangkok after a long, long flight and a refused entry because you have a novelty stamp on your passport.
Yeah. Oh, God, that's a good tip there. Somebody wants to know, can I get my old passport back? I sent one away years ago. I had loads of stamps on it, and I never got it back when I got my new one. I had so many good stamps on there. So is that old passport being thrown away, probably?
Yeah, generally trying to get it back after a couple of years. There isn't a problem with a cancelled passport. Once it's been marked as cancelled, sometimes they put two holes in it. I think if you ask for it back, you should be able to get it back. I'm not sure they will be prepared to I don't think they hang on to them. I think I would be really, really surprised if you got one from a couple of years ago back. But if you need it, lots of people hold on to their expired passports because they like it's a particular memory to them. Yeah. There's no legal implication of that. It means that it can't be used. It's quite clearly cancelled.
If, though, you loved getting stamps on your passport and you arrive back in Ireland, can you ask for a stamp on your Irish passport in Ireland?
No.
Well, I mean, is there any legal impediment or morally, right, you feck off, you have an Irish passport?
I'm sure you can. If they're putting novelty stamps, if somebody wants an Irish stamp in your Irish passport, I'm sure they'll allow it. But here's another thing. Make sure you have a blank page for some countries. People have been refused entry into countries because they don't have a blank page with no stamp on it. This is really important for one of our big honeymoon destinations, South Africa. And the other thing is you don't actually get to the country. You don't get to argue with the border official. It's usually the person at the check-in desk who checks your paperwork that says you can't get on the flight. People have been refused admission onto a flight, usually at Amsterdam or Heathrow, wherever they've flown to get the direct flight to South Africa, and told you don't have a blank page on your passport, you're not going to South Africa. Another really important thing to remember.
Excellent tip. Owen, thanks a million, as ever.
Always a huge pleasure.
That was Owen Corrie there from Travel Extra. I'm 68. Says one texter, I've all my cancelled passports since I was 21. Isn't that amazing? Remember going into railings with someone else a number of years ago and getting so many stamps on my passport when travelling through Eastern Europe. The inspectors would come on the trains at night and stamp our passports. Someone else was very nearly refused entry to the US around 2004 because I had a Tunisian stamp on my passport. When questioned about what I was doing in a Muslim country, I replied, mostly stayed on the beach drinking beer. The immigration officer didn't get my sarcasm, and I was held in question for 2 hours. The kicker was that the immigration officer was Irish-American with the strongest Kerry accent. I eventually realised, was released and made my flight. Well, there is a lesson in that. Actually, because I remember that there's a place in Grafton Street where you can go and get your shots when you go, when you're in advance of going to countries where you have to have shots, and they have a big sign on the wall saying sarcasm does not work on border guards. Remember, you get a copy slip of the visa to Cuba, but it must be given back on exit so that you know you've entered illegally. So Jerry says, I used to live in the Caribbean, and we once sailed from Antigua to Montserrat for a day out, but also to get the shamrock stamped on our passport. The journey over was horrendous, with choppy seas and many physically sick. Once we got to Montserrat, the captain of the boat took all our passports for immigration, and once he then returned, we all got off the boat, wandered around Montserrat for about 2 hours, still feeling the effects of the journey over. We got back on the boat to Antigua, and the journey back was even worse. After getting off in Antigua and just wanted to go home, the captain gave us all our passports back, and not one of them had a shamrock stamp. So that was a trip worth taking, I would have thought. Collie in Dublin says, went to Iran a few years ago, then wanted to go to New York. So had to go to the embassy for an interview. Was like queuing at a post office and hearing other people's reasons for needing a visa, as opposed to the ESTA. Lads getting into fights in Vegas and girlfriends locking them out of the hotel room because they were hammered and fell asleep. So hotel staff called the cops as he was banging on the door to wake up the girlfriend along with everyone else. No confidentiality at all, but very funny. That is true. And certainly if that's your experience at the, I kind of experienced the same thing when you go to the American Embassy in Dublin. You're just queuing up. It is like being at a post office. And now, Owen's gone now. But hi there. Could you ask your guest? I was over on a J1 in America last summer. I went over to work in a bar, but ended up working on the sites for cash. Do you think this would affect me getting an ESTA visa for the US? Well, I don't know. It depends. I suppose, the tax officials in the US, were they aware that you were working for cash? Or did they just think you were just in America for a few months, and Mammy and Daddy were paying for you? And Oliver says, there is an episode of Banged Up Abroad where an English lady escapes Argentina while on bail. She swims across the border to Brazil, then claims her passport was stolen at the embassy. She was given a temporary passport at the airport. There was an issue as they didn't have a record of her entry. The officer let her through to board a flight back to London. The Argentinians tried to extradite her, but failed as they couldn't prove she wouldn't face human rights abuses, says Oliver. Well, I suppose she had a great story for when she got home. You are listening to The Moncrief Show on News Talk.